Okay, here we go. Chukat and Balak. Okay, so the name of the parsha Chukat means statute of the Torah. Chok, decree, law, statute of the Torah, and is found in Numbers chapter 19, verse 2. The name of the parsha Balak refers to Balak, the king of Moab, and is found in Numbers 22. Like we said, there's two different parshas that are coming together. Okay, Moses is taught the laws of the red heifer, whose ashes purify a person who has been contaminated by contact with a dead body. So that's a portion for itself. We know that the laws of purity and impurity are the laws of the Torah. They're not necessarily logical, but here we have an introduction of the laws of specifically the red heifer, which is critical for the impurity from coming in contact with a dead person. We can elaborate upon this, but let's move on for right now. After 40 years of journeying through the desert, the people of Israel arrive in the wilderness of Tzin. So they're approaching the promised land. Miriam dies, and the people thirst for water. God tells Moses to speak to the rock and command it to give water. Moses gets angry at the rebellious Israelites and strikes the stone. Water issues forth, but Moses is told by God that neither he nor Aaron will enter the promised land because they did not sanctify God's name. So this is a cryptic story because nobody knows what's so terrible about hitting the rock instead of speaking to the rock. But either way, this is the story where it's decreed that Moses and Aaron would not cross the Jordan with the people, but they will remain outside of Israel, east of the Jordan. Aaron dies at Hor Hahar and is succeeded in the high priesthood by his son Eleazar. Venomous snakes attack the Israelite camp after yet another eruption of discontent, in which the people speak against God and Moses. God tells Moses to place a brass serpent upon a high pole, and all who gaze heavenward will be healed. The people sing a song in honor of the miraculous well that provided the water in the desert. Moses leads the people in battle against the Amorite kings Sichon and Og, who seek to prevent Israel's passage through their territory, and conquers their land, which lies east of the Jordan. So they conquer a nice big chunk of land that was not supposed to be part of Israel. It's east of the Jordan River, and now the Jewish people control it, and we'll read more about what happened to it toward the end of the book of Exodus of Numbers in 2 weeks from now. So that's the first parsha. If that was not eventful enough, we get another whole parsha, which is very unusual, very different than most parshas, because if you'll see in a minute, it's not doesn't really describe anything that happened to the Jewish people. It's about how people around the Jewish people react to the Jewish people. So this is the sometimes strange story of Balak, the king of Moab, who summons the prophet Bilam to curse the people of Israel. On the way, Bilam is berated by his donkey, who sees the angel that God sent to block their way before Bilam does. 3 times from 3 different vantage points, Bilam attempts to pronounce his curses, each time's blessings issue instead. Bilam also prophesies on the end of days and the coming of Mashiach. So this is very, I guess, some of the most beautiful poetry in the 5 books of Moses is in this week's parsha, and it's said not by Moses but by the Gentile prophet, who is a complicated man to say the least, and it really came to attempt to curse the Jews and ends up blessing the Jews. So there's a lot to unpack there. The people fall prey to the charms of the daughters of Moab and are enticed to worship the idol Peor. When a high-ranking Israelite official publicly takes a Midianite princess into his tent, Pinchas kills them both, stopping the plague raging among the people. So that's the end of that story, which leads into next week's parsha, which is dedicated to Pinchas, and that's when we could analyze what Pinchas did and why it was a good idea and why it was a bad idea. Either way, so there's really two stories, two parshas that are absolutely packed with content and so I'm looking forward to the excitement, but there's a lot going on here. If anybody wants to make any comment on anything we read in the nutshell, please do. Otherwise, the journey begins. Okay, so let's spend a minute or two about the concept of the red heifer and purity and impurity And maybe we'll also talk about why it is written right here, because there's a good chance that the parsha was not said here. The parsha was said earlier because before they, in the past, they already had to become pure in order to eat the Passover offering earlier in the fourth book of the Torah. So they must have had received this law. But this law is not written down to precisely this place. And the question is, how come? And we can address that as well. But essentially, what happens is like this. In the Torah, there are laws of purity and impurity. And we always talk about the idea that in the Torah, there's really three categories of laws. There's what they call mishpatim, ordinances, laws that make sense. There's the ideas that edut, testimonials, that laws that are here to celebrate the past. For example, Passover, it's testimonial to an event that happened in our history. And then there's a category of laws that are called a chok. Chok is decree or a statute. And the whole idea is that they don't make any sense, that we do them because God told us to do them. And that's it. There's nothing else to say about it. And within that category, the laws of purity and impurity fall in that category, that they don't make any sense. It's not something that is logical or tangible. It's metaphysical. And of all of those decrees of purity and impurity and the laws that we don't understand, the law of the red heifer, of the red cow, is the greatest of all decrees, meaning it's the most illogical. And there's a verse of King Solomon who's supposed to be the wisest of men, who says, Amarti achakma, I said I want to become smart, I want to become wise, but it is distant from me. And the sages say that he was referring to the mitzvot of the Torah. I tried to understand every mitzvah. And King Solomon says, I can understand every mitzvah, but I cannot understand the red cow, the red heifer. And that's because, in addition to being purity and impurity, which in general is not that logical, there are also internal paradoxes within the law. So if it's in the paradoxes make it hard to understand. Okay, so that's why the opening statement of the parsha, this is the decree of the Torah. And the sages say, 1 second, it's not the decree of the Torah, it's the decree of the red heifer. Why do you introduce it to be, this is the decree of the Torah? And the answer is because what we mean is this is the ultimate decree of the whole Torah. Of all the decrees of the Torah, of all the laws in the Torah that are super rational, this one is the most so. So that's on one level. But then you get to the Hasidic commentaries, and not just even pre-Hasidic. You have Maimonides says this, that even though we understand that these laws are super rational, they're higher than our understanding, we still should try to attempt to understand what these laws represent. And in that case, you look at this law and you say, this is the decree of the Torah. Again, not the decree of the heifer, but the decree of the Torah. In some ways, what it's telling us is, if you want to understand the purpose of the whole Torah, or you want to understand the essential teaching of the whole Torah, you have to look at this mitzvah. So all of a sudden, from a mitzvah that we just do because God told us to do, once you get to the commentators and the Hasidic commentators and different genres of commentary, you say, yes, we don't fully understand it, but on the other hand, there are messages that we can take from here that tell us, that speak to the essence and core of the Torah. And there are multiple ways of thinking about this. I would like to present one or two, and we'll see how it goes. You tell me which one you like better, and then we'll see if we move on to other stories. So that's the roadmap for the next few minutes, with your permission. So that's the plan. Okay. Meantime, l'chaim. Okay, what is the essential? Yeah. What essentially happens with the red cow, with the red heifer? Somebody becomes pure. So there's different levels of impurity. The most severe level of impurity is somebody comes in contact with a dead body. Then there's lesser degrees. If I touch someone who touched a dead body, or I touched an object, I touched a dead body. So there's all kinds of laws. Then, the part of the purification process is I have to go to the temple where they slaughter the red cow. It has to be red, completely red. They take the ashes of the red cow, they burn it outside the temple, and take the ashes of the red cow, and they mix it with water. And then that mixture, the ashes of the red cow and the water, are mixed together. And then that is sprinkled on the person who would like to become pure. And it has to be done twice, on the third day and on the seventh day. and that's when they are pure. That's essentially what's happening. And the internal paradox is that the priest who prepares the red heifer, he himself becomes impure. Not to that same degree of impurity, but a lesser degree of impurity. So there were all kinds of internal inconsistencies. And now the question is, what does all this represent? What is the ash? What is the water? What is the importance? What's the significance? And most important is, what is the relevance to us? Because if this is the decree of the Torah, and in some ways it has to capture the message of all of the Torah, how does this become relevant to us, especially today, where in this practical sense we don't practice the laws of purity and impurity because we're all considered ritually impure, and we cannot become ritually pure. So all of this is still in the realm of theoretical. It's not that practical right now, but theoretical just means the spiritual side of this is what we're thinking about and internalizing. Go ahead, Dr. Tamarin, please.
Rabbi, is this choice of a young female pre-cow, a heifer, before it gives birth profoundly symbolically significant, that particular choice?
The answer has to be yes. What it signifies, I'm not sure I know. I'll try it, I'll attempt. But the answer is yes. Torah is very specific. It has to be young. It has to have no yoke upon it, meaning it wasn't tamed in any sort of way. It's still very free and still very wild in a way. It's not and completely red, and red is the color of passion, right? So obviously these are, and if it's missing some redness, if it's not completely red, then it's not fit to be the red heifer. So the answer is yes, it's significant. In the legal sense, it's significant, and obviously in the spiritual sense, it is as well. Hopefully, we can at least attempt to explain at least some of those details. But the answer must be yes. Do I know the answer? I don't know, but I know the answer has to be yes. Okay, so let's make an attempt at this. There's all kinds of ways. I said I'm going to do two, but now I'm having a change of heart. Maybe we'll do three. Maybe we'll try to be ambitious because each one is so beautiful, and each one is so beautiful that I can't decide which one to say. So you just do one of each, right? I come to the dessert table and I say, I don't know which dessert to choose. I just say one of each. So if that's true about dessert, same should be about the Torah. Okay. Let's start with the Hasidic view. The Hasidic view is like this. Um, what is the thing you have here? You have the person is impure. What is impure? Depending on how you define it, but impure is related, it's negative. Okay. How do I become, how do I become, how do I become pure? In other words, I have some negativity within myself, some negative impulses or negative passions. How do I purify myself from this passion, from this passion or from this negativity? So if you start reading the Kabbalah, you're going to see that early on, if you go to, let's say, to the book of Ezekiel, the prophet, he in his vision, he sees the vision of Ezekiel, he sees the divine chariots. And that's like the most explicit Kabbalistic references in the Bible. And he talks about there's the chariot of God, and there's four sides, and there's four faces, and the lion is on the right side, and the ox is on the left side. So the Kabbalah is going to tell you ox is left. Left is negative. Left is contraction. So left is less holy light. So the cow, the bull, the ox, these are the left side. They represent, in a way, negativity, but in the context of the lack of divine light. Because the right side is expression. So expression of the divine light, and the left side is holding back. And when you hold back divine light, you get darkness, you get the space for negativity. And Kabbalistically speaking, that's where the ox is, represents the contraction or the ability, the space for negativity. And then you get red in the Kabbalah also. White is kindness, white is expression of godliness, red is passion, but negative passion, and also the color of I don't know exactly the words. I don't know if I'm picking the right words, but negative passion, cruelty, like hunting. That's that. Asav was red, so red is the left side. Cow, a heifer or an ox or a cow are the left side. This looks like we're basically taking, we're basically challenging the bull. You know, the bull who sees something like the bull who sees the red cloth. So the bull could represent the untamed passion of the animal side, of the biological side of self. And that's why Dr. Tamron says it's not, it's completely red, meaning it's completely related to the idea of negative passion. And it doesn't have, never had a yoke. A yoke represents that it's tamed somewhat. And even giving birth is an act of kindness. So it did not give birth. Okay, so now we have the untamed negative passion. That should be as close as a symbol as you get to quote unquote the enemy, the negative, the internal animal that doesn't want to be tamed. Okay, what happens in this mitzvah, and why is this such an amazing mitzvah when you think about it from the Kabbalistic lens? What happens is, what the Torah is telling you is that this red heifer, which should be the symbol for untamed negative passion, is not only that symbol itself becomes the purifying agent. You cannot purify the most severe impurity, the impurity that comes from coming in contact with death, and death represents disconnection from God because God is the source of life. You cannot cure it without the red heifer. So, in simple English, what it means like this: a person has a negative passion. That negative passion seems to be destructive and self-destructive, and in some cases, it can be catastrophic. But what the Kabbalah is teaching you, what Judaism teaches you, articulated by the Kabbalah, but it's really Judaism's message, is that ultimately everything comes from God. So ultimately everything has a spark of holiness. Even the most destructive force at its core, even the most destructive the force at its core, not only is it not destructive, but it's actually purifying. So, for example, a person has a destructive desire. What does a person really want? A person wants to engage in something negative. What do they really, really want? What they really want is to experience pleasure. The experience of pleasure is not negative. In fact, the experience of pleasure could bring you closer to God because the ultimate pleasure is closeness to God. So, what is negative about the destructive feeling is not the fact that I want what's good for me and that I want pleasure. That's not the problem. The problem is the external expression of that feeling, of that desire, of that need. I need pleasure. I need to be loved. I need to be understood. I need to be comforted. Now, sometimes I look in the wrong places for those things, and that becomes self-destructive. But the solution is not to destroy the negative, the desire for passion or the desire for pleasure. That's not the solution. If I do that, I won't be able to become pure. Purifying agent means take the core of what you're feeling of the negative experience or the power of pleasure, mix it with water, mix it with something productive, and then that becomes the purifying agent. Because what's going to lead you closer to Hashem is that desire for comfort, that desire for pleasure, and that desire to be connected. So what we're saying here is this is a very general idea. And that's what we say. This is the law of the Torah. This is in a way the most general thing you could say. Almost nothing in the world, nothing that I experience. The negative is only the external expression of it. And if you want to go back to the story, what do? You burn the red heifer, but the ashes become the purifying agent. What does ashes represent? In some ways, the ashes as a symbol is the core, because when you burn everything else out, when you let the air out, and you let the wind out, and you let everything else out, what's left is the symbol of the essence. And the ashes is the symbol for the essence, that cannot be self-destructed. So you take that essence of the negative desire, and not only is it not negative anymore, but it's actually critical to cultivate that desire to create that power to create the purity. So it's an amazing concept of how we think of ourselves and how we think of the negativity within self. And we understand that even a negative desire is not really negative. What's negative, it would be the external expression of that desire, but the energy of that desire, the essence of that desire, the fact that I want to become close that I want to experience pleasure and experience bliss, that is not negative. In fact, that's purifying. So that's That's one way to read this whole story, to read the law, the meaning of the law of the red heifer, and why the symbolism of the red heifer. And in that sense, it's very relevant to us because we each have the left side and the right side. We have the more spiritual and more transcendent side of self, but we also have the more animalistic side of self. Now, you look at the animal. What do you say? The animal's an animal. The negative desires of the animal are all are negative, and then we're saying, but the energy it's not at the core, it's not negative. In fact, at the core, it can be purifying. So that is theme number one, is to think about how um, to find purity is not to destroy the passion or to slaughter the passion, but to direct it to get to figure out what it really wants and and channel it to find what it really wants in the proper place and in the proper way and in a healthy way. And that's a very profound point because it goes to the core of what Judaism teaches is that ultimately everything comes back, can trace back to the oneness of God. It's not like there's God and there's Satan. It's not like there's God and negative. Even the negative at the source is holy. Now, the break happens between the source of the negativity and the actual negativity, right? So there's a break. Sometimes the disconnect, and we'll talk about that later. Later in the parsha, that theme keeps popping up again and again. But at the start, we're saying is the symbol of the most negative and the most animalistic. It's untamed. It's left side. It's an ox. Or a bull or a sheep or a female ox. Same thing. Same concept. If you're talking about from the Kabbalistic perspective, it's red. It's completely red. This is the symbol of the enemy. This is not the enemy. This is the pure. This is the purification agent. So I think this is profound. Go ahead, Vicky, please.
Beautiful, thank you, Rabbi. So the Torah, this parsha starts with this is the decree of the Torah. So
Yeah.
is there my understanding is there's nowhere else that it says so, and it also because it's so like the pshat is so unclear. So in cases like that, is it like an invitation for us to dig deeper? Because and my second question is, was the ideas of Kabbalah that you just described were passed down to Moses?
Um, so this is two separate questions. I'm pretty sure, yeah, I think that when you say it's a decree, it means that you have it. So even though we explain it, we're basically saying that, yeah, I don't think anywhere else it says this is the decree of the Torah. I don't think anywhere, so it doesn't say, this is the only place it says this exact phrase. When you say it's a decree, when I offer an interpretation, it doesn't mean this is the ultimate interpretation. Could be there are deeper interpretations, could be there are more. But what we're saying is we're trying to an attempt to get to something that is beyond the human grasp. And the Torah is divine wisdom. So don't be surprised that not everything is understood. In fact, if everything is understood, then you'd say, is this really divine wisdom? Or somebody else could have written it, right? So the idea is that when you have a decree, even when something makes sense, if you dig deeper, you'll see it doesn't make sense because the commentaries point out that even the mitzvot that make sense, there are details that don't make sense, right? There's always a footprint of ultimately this is an expression of a divine will that's super rational. And then you can try to understand those. There's invitation to go dig deeper. But yeah, the point is because divine wisdom is infinite and it's infinitely greater than the human wisdom. So we're always going to find things where this sort of is beyond our capacity to understand, and we have to keep growing. You see what I'm saying? So yes, it is an invitation. Give me just 1 second. I apologize. Okay, so that's your first question. Your second question was, I remember that was the harder question, but I don't remember what it was. That was the harder one. Yeah, that was the second one. I think that was the second one.
No, this this
Yeah.
this one was about the ideas of Kabbalah, where they pass.
Oh, did Moshe know this? So that's a very good question. How much of the when Moses understood this? So it's actually interesting that the Medrash says that Moshe did understand that this Moshe was given insight to the reason of this mitzvah. So so did he know Kabbalah the way we know Kabbalah in those terms? Probably not. But you could boil down to the point that Hashem Echad, that there's oneness, that even the negative has a higher source. Yeah, This is pretty basic to Judaism. Yeah, even if it wasn't expressed. I mean, if you really think about what the messages that Moshe is saying in Deuteronomy, that there's only oneness, then I think you have to say that he had the insight into this. But when I say it's a paradox and it's not understood, it's even when I say it's so one of the things you say it's a decree is because if what is a secret? Okay. When you say Torah is the Kabbalah is mysterious, it's the mystical secrets of the Torah. What does it mean that it's a secret? So a secret means nobody knows. Nobody heard about it. So it's a secret, right? That's one level of being a secret. But but another interpretation of secret is that even when you hear it, it's still a secret because it's counterintuitive or it doesn't seem to add up. So that's the mean that it's secret. A secret means even if I tell you the formula, even if I tell you something, but it's still surprising because it's counterintuitive and it seems the opposite. So this example that I see as my most destructive force, actually, if you boil it down and burn it down and get to the core and say, what does I really want? I really want to become close to God. That's something that even if I tell it to myself, it's still surprising every time. It's still a novelty. It's still a secret. It's still something that's not obvious that you have to dig deep to experience it. So that's when I say it's the mystery. This is the mystery of the Torah. So one mystery is because no one ever told it to me. But another mystery is even after it was told to me, it's still mysterious. It's still awesome. It's still counterintuitive. And it's still hard to experience until you actually experience it. So in that sense, it still remains a decree. Don't think that because you came to this call and it's 12:34 and you got the reason, now it's no longer a decree. It's still a decree. First of all, it has other interpretations, yes, but even this interpretation itself is a decree because it's you have that's not the way we experience it. We experience it as if something negative is something destructive. And then if I say if I can now transform this, it will become a mitzvah, it will become positive. It's true only once I transform it, right? So once I do the hard work, I could yes burn it down and get the passion and become close to Hashem. And it's still shocking that whoa, that same energy that was driving me to the negative is now driving me to the positive. That's the mystery. That's the secret. That's the secret that even after you find out the secret, it's still a secret. So that's what I'm trying to say. Okay, that's point number one. Um, we can keep at this point. You know what? Should we keep this point? Yeah, let's go to before we go to 2 and 3. I want to go back to another story in the parsha, the end of this parsha, and this idea. Because I was thinking about it this morning, these two parshas, usually when there's two parshas that are put together, it's because they're somewhat related. These two parshas, they're almost never together, and they seem to be completely unrelated. So it's like, what's the binding theme between these two parshas? And on the surface, you don't necessarily see a binding theme, except chronologically, they happen at the same period of time. But conceptually, what is the conceptual connection between these parshas? And could you find a theme throughout many of the stories of these two parshas? And I think that at least what I can think of is if you want to look at it through the lens of the first interpretation that we offered, which is the Hasidic interpretation, then you would get to the idea that the thing would have to be transformation, right? So you're taking the red heifer, which is a symbol of the left, symbol of negative passion, and you're making it the purifying agent. And how you're doing it? Because you're showing at the core, at the source, what does it really want? It doesn't want you to be engaged in the self-destructive behavior just for momentary pleasure. It really wants connection. It really wants to connect to its source. It really wants you to connect to God. But because it is disconnected from its source, it doesn't really even understand what it wants, right? It's like if I go to the psychologist and I say, I'm feeling this. So it used to be before psychology was discovered, it used to be, I thought, I know I'm the expert of how I feel. Can't tell you. I know how I feel. You don't know how I feel. But now people pay a lot of money to go to the expert, and the expert says, you feel this, but this is only the tip of the iceberg. What's really happening is that in your subconscious, there's a lot more going on. And it could be that what you feel is in some way a distortion of a different feeling that's really deeper. And you can go back to the source and you can heal what you're feeling right now. So in some ways, that's exactly what's happening here. We're saying, I feel this, but if you go back to the source, you can create that transformation and that healing, and then the negative, what used to be a negative desire, a negative impulse, is now not just not negative, but now it's a pure. Now, not only is it not neutral, not only is it not negative but neutral, but it's actually purifying. It's going to pull you closer to Hashem. So that theme of transformation, I think you could see throughout the parsha. And one of the places you could see it is a very cryptic part. It's a strange story because it looks very pagan. Basically, people complain. God sends the snakes. The snakes bite the Jews. Moshe says, God says, what are we going to do? God says, okay, make a copper serpent. It doesn't say copper. Make a serpent, put it on a staff, make it very high. Anyone who will look up and look at the serpent will be healed. And that's exactly what Moshe did. Whoever looked up made the serpent, made a copper serpent, made the serpent, put it on the pole. Whoever looked up and saw it was healed. Now that is a very strange story because first of all, since when does the serpent have any power to heal? First of all, serpent is a sign of negativity, like the original serpent in the Garden of Eden. But what does that mean that the serpent heals? That's what about praying to God, right? And this is a very big question. Such a big question that it actually creeps in to the Mishnah, which the Mishnah is a book of law. And there are very few commentaries in the Mishnah. Mishnah is all law, but there's one of few places where the Mishnah sort of veers off to philosophy. And one of the places in Tractate Rosh Hashanah, when it talks about the blowing of the shofar, which is another interesting connection, but we'll leave that alone for right now. The Mishnah says, "What does a serpent give life and a serpent cause death?" Because that's what it says. It says, "Whoever looks up sees the serpent will live, and whoever doesn't see the serpent, whoever doesn't look up will die." So the Mishnah says, how could that be? Is it possible that whoever that the serpent itself is the cause of life, of healing? That makes no sense. That's very pagan. The source of healing is God. And by the way, the Mishnah there finds a similar story. The similar story is that earlier in the second book of the Torah in Exodus, when the Jewish people battled Amalek, it says Moshe so there was the battle going on. Moshe was on the mountain praying to God. Then when he prayed, he lifted his hands. And then it says Moshe's hands were heavy. And the problem was that when he got tired, he put his hands down. When he put his hands down, the Jewish people would Amalek would overpower the Jews. And only when his hands were up, this is the verse. This is not the Medrash. The verse is when his hands were up. That's when the Jewish people would be victorious. So what does they do? What do? They took a stone. Moshe sat on the stone, and he had two people, Aaron and Hur, his brother and his nephew, holding up his hands, and that's how they were successful. So the Mishnah says the same story. What are you talking about? Does Moshe's hands heal? May bring victory? They have to look at Moshe's hands. That's ridiculous. God is the one who brings victory, not Moshe's hands. And same thing in this story. The snake, does the snake bring healing? It's not the snake, it's God. So the Mishnah's answer, but I'm going to give the Kabbalistic answer is a little bit different, but the Mishnah's answer it has nothing to do with the snake. The snake is really just to get the people. The key is that the snake was on a pole. So the people are looking upward. When you look upward and you look heavenward, then you think about Hashem. And the same thing with Moshe's hands. It's not Moshe's hands, but they're fighting in the battle. And they see Moshe's hands, and they see Moshe's hands turning upward in prayer. Then they think about heaven, they think about God, and then they're victorious. So that's what the Mishnah says. That's how the Mishnah solves the problem of how could it be that the serpent is causing life and the serpent is causing death, or if you don't look at the serpent, you die. Now that's a wonderful answer. But if that's the answer, who needs a serpent? Why do you have the symbol of negativity? Why do you need the serpent? Right? Just say anything. Let's put a pole. Doesn't matter what you put up. Put anything. Put a white flag. I don't care. The point is not the serpent. The point is to look upward. And yet the Torah says clearly, God tells Moshe, make a nachash, make a masaraf, which is another word for snake. And Moshe makes it out of copper, and copper is also interesting, the interesting choice, because copper in Hebrew, nechoshet, is related to the word of being brazen, like chutzpah, like not humble. So here he takes the symbol. Not only is it a serpent, but it's a brazen serpent, because that's what the word copper means in Hebrew. And then he puts it up. And so what? Why the specification? Put up anything. It doesn't matter what you put up, as long as you're looking heavenward, looking toward God. And here you get the Hasidic interpretation. The Hasidic interpretation is that it's the same theme that we're talking about now. Something negative happens. You have the serpent. Why does something negative happen? In its source, everything is good. Everything that happens is good. Even the negative thing, if you go to the source, why did this happen to me? It's for a good cause. The problem is in this physical world, because we're in a world of spiritual darkness, we don't always see how the negative is really for good. Now, in a way, that's the difference between the symbol of a stick and a serpent. So a stick is a straight line. So you can see the straight line, the flowing, the higher, the line, the vertical line from above to below. That's a metaphor how the energy of God flows downward in a direct line. You could track the line. Now, a serpent does never work straight. The serpent is always moving back and forth. It's always zigzagged, meaning you don't see how the origin and the source plays out in this physical world. What does God say? God say, you know how you heal when you get bitten by the serpent? The only way to heal is to raise the serpent and lift it up, meaning look at the serpent in its source. Why did God send this? What's the message that I'm supposed to take? From God's perspective, what's the positive that this serpent is supposed to cause? And if you could connect the serpent to its source, then you get healing. Connected to the beginning of the parsha, if you could take the red heifer and look at it not as the impulse, the negative impulse that it's experiencing right now, but you want to look at it from the point of view of its source, of its essence, of its core, the core, what the Kabbalah would call koach hamitaveh, the power of desire. The core is not only negative, but the core is not only, like I said, not only is it not negative and neutral, but it's actually purifying. So here you have the same theme at least twice, and maybe we'll go straight to the third place where you see it, which is the entire second parsha. Really, it's all about transformation, and you'll see how maybe that's the common theme of why these parshas would be brought together. So we could tie it into that. Give me a minute or two. We'll say a little l'chaim on the tea, and then we'll wrap the second parsha into this theme as well. Then, if we have time to go back and start again and look at the other perspectives, because the other perspectives are important as well. Okay, so before we set up the third portion, the third story where this appears in the second portion is a total strange parsha. Why is it so strange? Because other than the final end with the daughters of Moab, that entire parsha is completely irrelevant. It does not advance the plot at all. What happens? The Jewish people are at the Jordan River. There's one Gentile who's afraid, hires another Gentile to curse the Jews. The guy shows up, instead of curses them, blesses them. It's possible that at the time they didn't even know that it happened. It's not a story about the Jews. It's a story about how people around the Jews reacted and thought about the Jewish people. So seemingly, if I deleted that entire parsha, except for the seventh reading, which is important for the plot, they straight after the daughters of Moab, Pinchas gets involved. But that's the very end. That whole story, that whole story, it's actually in the Torah itself. It's one long paragraph, great detail about this debate between the king and the prophet, and he doesn't want to come, and he finally comes, and then the angel tries to stop him, and his donkey talks to him. It's the strangest parsha in the Torah, no question about it. And it doesn't advance any plot, doesn't do anything. Why do I need it here for? That's one question. Next question. It happens to be that the written Torah does not speak about the Messianic era a lot, and it doesn't speak about Messiah, about the King Messiah, about an individual who will lead the people. Doesn't mention the Mashiach at all. It does allude to the Messianic era in Deuteronomy, but there are very, very few places that there's a mention of Messianic era. It's maybe once or twice, but the Mashiach himself not mentioned. And the only time it's alluded to is in this parsha, where at the end, after blessing the Jews three times, he's about to go back to his home, the prophet, and he says, "Let me tell you what's going to happen in the future days." And then he starts talking about the future, and he starts saying verses that we understand to mean first King David, who was the first Messiah, the first anointed one, and ultimately the ultimate Mashiach, the ultimate anointed one. Okay, so this is in some ways this is a very important story. Messianic era is ultimately the purpose of creation. In other words, it's the goal when the world reaches peace and harmony. So you would expect the allusion to the Messianic era to come from the Torah itself, from Moshe. And yet it comes from Bilam, who's a questionable man, a great prophet, but he uses his prophecy for the negative. And why is he the one to bring in this theme? So, in short, what we're trying to say here is this is story. It's not directly connected to the plot of the Jewish people. It doesn't advance the plot at all. But if you zoom out, in some ways, this parsha is the most important parsha because the Jewish mission and the Jewish story, as we know all the way from Abraham, is not just for the Jewish people. God tells Abraham, Av Hamon Goyim Taticha. He changes his name and he says, I'm making you a father of a multitude of nations. In other words, the ultimate goal is not just that the Jewish people have a relationship with God and live out this relationship and are connected and devoted to God. That is a very important part of the Torah. But that's not the whole story, and it's not the ultimate goal. The ultimate goal is that connection, that relationship, is ultimately transforms the rest of the people and all the people of the earth, and ultimately the entire world. Now, transformation has to come, not superimposed from the outside, has to come from the people themselves. So who is going to be the one to transform? Who is going to be the one to show that even the biggest hater of the Jewish people, who would willing to travel hundreds of kilometers to come and curse the Jews, and he is transformed to give the most beautiful blessings? That is not a side story. That's not just we have an extra parsha, we have some extra space, let's fill it in so we can get some poetry into this text. This, in a way, is the most important point of the Torah. In a way, what it's telling you is what's the Jewish mission to the world? The Jewish mission to the world is symbolized by the fact that people like Bilam are able ultimately to transform and recognize the unique relationship that God has with the Jewish people and how that's supposed to influence the rest of the world. And in a way, that's the Messianic era. What's the Messianic era? It's not primarily a Jewish story. Messianic era is that there's peace and harmony in the entire world. So who's the one who's supposed to come and be the herald or tell people about this Messianic era and this theme of transformation? Then there's no better candidate than Bilam, because if it's Moses, then it's superimposed, and superimposition is not transformation. Transformation means comes from within. And therefore, if you want to look at these two portions, starting with the red heifer, which is taking the negative, the red cow, the negative temptation, and turning it into a purifying agent, because that passion is really a drive to be connected and to be accepted and to be loved and to get pleasure. All those words are all ways to connect to God. So the red heifer ultimately, even though at the surface it's negative, at the core, it's transformative. And the same thing within all negativity that happens in the world. The snake represents any negative thing that happens. And now I have a choice. Either the negative thing that happens to me, the challenge, is either going to bite me and kill me, or I have to look at it from the perspective, the divine perspective, raise it up to its source and say, what was the intention of God to make this happen to me? That is the place of healing, because I'm lifting it up to its source. And then not only does it become something that will kill me, it will actually bring me life. That has the transformative power. And then these themes trickle from the first parsha, trickle out to the next parsha, and this is how it plays out in the rest of the world. And in the second parsha, we don't even have to lift a finger. We're not doing anything. But that theme of transformation that we experience in the first parsha, in Chukat, ultimately will transform to the rest of the parsha, to the rest of the world in the second parsha. So I think that if you want to find a common thread between all these parshas, between these two parshas, I think that's one common theme that you'll find, the idea of transformation. And by the way, the tragedies in this parsha is where the opportunity for transformation have been missed. And of course, I'm talking to the event that Moshe hits the rock, which is the most cryptic story in the Torah. But maybe if we have time, we'll get to it. If not, we'll get to it next year. Also, what was missed in this story is you missed the idea of transformation. And that also fits into our puzzle where that's what we're dealing with. We're 40 years after we left Egypt. There's no time anymore for the time has come for transformation. That's my point. Go ahead, Vicky, please.
Well, thank you, Rebbe, to connect with all those very important pieces of the puzzle together. That was beautiful. I had a question about Balak. So the Jewish people are not mentioned here, but they kind of are in a way.
So they're mentioned, but they don't do anything. They're not. It's
Right.
about them. It's about them, but they are not active. They're not active in the story.
Yeah, so my question is, I think we are mentioned in that parsha because we are influencing in a way, because he looked, so that's in a way most important point, because that's the only way we can influence the world by placing the tents, because people look at us and then they realize the importance of.
Yeah, 100%. Just like then, just like now, they're always talking about us. I guarantee you, it doesn't matter what we do. Open up the press, do a Google, put it into Google News. Israel is going to be in the papers, right? So we obviously so there's a lot of tumult. Everybody's reacting to the Jewish people. There's no question about that. My point is only in this story, it's not a story. The Jewish person has no active role, and yet all this activity is happening around them. We stir the pot, and that's another story. Why are we stirring the pot? Why are we getting everyone so upset? And in fact, in that story, it's even strange because the guy, Balak, the king of Moab, Moab is our cousin. Moab is a descendant of Lot, who's the descendant of Abraham, nephew of Abraham. And we were explicitly told that we're not in this parsha, in the first parsha, that we're not allowed to have any sort of conflict with Moab or Ammon, our cousins, or Edom, our other cousin. So there was no question of a dispute over territory. We had no territorial claims. So, but still, they're very upset and they're very afraid. Why? That's a good question. If you look at the map of the Middle East today, we're getting a lot of people upset, even people who we don't have any border with, or we have no connection to. So we are stirring the pot. We've been doing it for a long time. We continue to do it. The point is that we're not doing anything actively. This is a result of the way we behave. And what you point out, for example, when it looks at the tense, just the fact that we live a certain lifestyle, that itself influences people. First, they get upset. First, they get uncomfortable. And hopefully, at the end, they adapt and internalize and transform.
Right. So it's not more like not only about stirring the pot, but more like influencing, setting an
Yeah. But I'm just saying the influence doesn't always happen easily, right? Sometimes usually the first response is, and first response sometimes take 1,000 years, 2,000 years, 3,000 years. These things take time, but the natural response is, I mean, the unfortunate, I don't want to say natural, but a response sometimes is the first response is a response of a negative response. Because if we live a certain lifestyle, what that does is it makes people question their lifestyle. And then people may not be willing to grow because growth is uncomfortable. And if you remind people that there's a higher way of living, some people will thank you and some people will be upset at you. So it's not always comfortable to be in the position of that the Jew is in the world just by the Jew's existence, just by being here, just by what you represent, what your history represents. The fact that we're here is a miracle. It's nothing to do with what we do, maybe what we do as well. But I'm just saying, just our existence is already enough to stir the pot. Stirring the pot is a good thing because you have to cook. You got to stir the pot if you want any transformation. But it's a process, and unfortunately, in our history, it's been a negative process a lot that it creates a lot of anti-Semitism. But the point is, the hopeful story is ultimately this is a story of transformation. Okay, so we have 4 minutes left, 5 minutes left. I really should stop here because I don't want to sort of open up other lenses. We covered a lot, but just to stay on the theme of transformation and talk for a minute or two about Moshe hitting the rock instead of speaking to the rock, which becomes this terrible sin that says because of that they're not allowed into the land of Israel. And all the commentaries are wondering why is that? What's the big deal? That's not a great sin. Moshe himself did things that were far worse. Who cares? What's at stake? And nobody has a good answer. How do I know no one has a good answer? Because most commentaries, when they address this question, they say, "Oh, I have 10 answers for you." Now, anytime anyone tells you they have 10 answers for you, you know what that means. It means there's no good one. So they try this one, try that one. Every year they try to come up with another one because there's no good one. So there is no good one. In fact, I like to say there's a commentary that says, no man knows Moshe's burial. Lo Yada, the last final verse of the Torah, it says, we know the region where he's buried, but it says, no, Lo Yada Ishet Kurato, no one knows his burial until this day. That's what the Torah says. No one knows where he's buried because we don't want to make him a shrine. We don't want him to become an idol. So no one knows exactly where Moshe is buried. But commentaries say nobody knows where Moshe is buried, meaning no one can understand why he's buried outside of Israel. Even after all the commentaries, and even after God says, because you hit the stone, you hit the rock, I didn't speak to it, and therefore you didn't sanctify my name, whatever that means. And again, like I said, this is not the worst thing Moshe did. But nobody. So it's a cryptic story. That's my point. Now the Kabbalists and offer different interpretations, which are very interesting. If you want to look at it from the theme of transformation, what makes the story so strange is that 40 years earlier there was a similar story. The Jewish people were thirsty. God said, "Go out, hit the stone, and the stone will give its water." And that's exactly what happened. Now you didn't hear about the story. You know why? Because it was a good ending. The people were thirsty. Moses hit the rock, and the water came forth. Mazel tov. 40 years later. There's another story. God says, speak to the rock. They hit the rock. God says, oh my God, crisis, you can't go into the land of Israel. So what's happening is like this. What's the difference between hitting the rock and speaking to the rock? Hitting represents you have to superimpose your will on nature. The rock is resistant. God said the rock should give water. But that's a miracle. Nature is resistant to miracles. Okay. Speaking means you're communicating with the stone, and the stone on its own, what it represents is that the stone on its own is going to give forth the water. It doesn't have to be forced. And if you want to think about it, the Medrash makes the point. The Medrash makes the point that if the Jewish people would see that by speaking to the stone gives its water, then they would understand themselves that God spoke to them and they would give forth the water without needing for it to be superimposed. What am I saying here? What I'm saying here is as follows. What I'm saying is that in the beginning of the history of the Jewish people first left Egypt, the the word of God was superimposed. And that's why at that point, hitting the stone was the right thing. But 40 years later, now is the time of transformation. The next generation, you don't have to hit them. You could speak to them. It's like the kid that grows up, you could talk to them. And Moshe is treating the new generation 40 years later the way he was treating the old generation. So it's not a sin that he can't go into the land of Israel. He can't go into the land of Israel because he's the leader of the old generation. He's not the leader of the new. So a new generation is a new leader. But the point is, the breakdown is the fact that Moshe doesn't recognize the power of transformation. Not because he's a bad leader, but because he was the leader of the first generation. And the second generation are already a generation that experienced transformation. And God says, don't hit them, speak to them. And God tells nature, you don't have to hit nature, you could speak to nature. In other words, that represents the idea that at this point, the negativity could be transformed. It doesn't have to be, you don't have to force it and fight it. So I think that all throughout the story, both in the positive stories and the negative stories, all throughout these two parshas, the theme of transformation reoccurs, and maybe that's the common theme. So that's the story in short. Finishing 1 minute early, look at that. If anyone has any comments or questions, please share. Otherwise, have a wonderful day and a wonderful week, and we should meet each other again in good health, continue to learn Torah and uncover the secrets, because even once we discover the secret, as I mentioned, there's still secrets. And also, no matter how many secrets we uncover, there's still more secrets to uncover, because the wisdom of God is infinite. Go ahead, Dr. Tamarin, please. Oh, you're muted. You're muted.
Is it possible that the answer to the difference between what Moses did the first time and the second time is easier, which is the first time he followed God's orders and the second time he didn't?
Yes, that's correct. On a basic level, you're 100% correct. But the question is, why does the order change? And what's the symbolism? What does that mean to us? And how we think of ourselves. In other words, the beginning, in other words, I wake up in the morning, at the beginning of my spiritual journey, I have to force myself. I don't have to hit myself, but hitting the rock represents you do the right thing because it's the right thing, even if you don't want to do it. Force yourself to do it. And at the beginning of your spiritual journey, that's a very healthy thing to do. But if your entire life you're just forcing yourself to do what's right, that's not the goal. The goal is that you don't have to force yourself anymore. The goal is that you transform to the point that you enjoy, you look forward to do the right thing. So that's why in the beginning of the story, God says you have to hit. Have to hit means you have to superimpose your will. Don't expect that any growth, spiritual growth, but any growth, don't expect it to come easy. You're going to have to be disciplined and force yourself to create any sort of growth. And that's why God says hit the rock. And that's why listening to God in that sense means hit the rock. Hit the rock means force yourself to do the right thing. Superimpose the divine will upon your own selfish or self-oriented or the side of stuff that's looking for immediate gratification. But the point here is you can't 40 years later, if you're still forcing yourself, that means you missed the point. 40 years later, you're doing the right thing because it feels right, because you were spoken to, because you were transformed. You don't have to force yourself anymore. So that's the takeaway. Of course, it's right that Moshe has to listen to God, but like I said, just veering off on the command of God itself doesn't always trigger such a big deal. For Moshe, it's a big deal. His life's goal was to get into Israel. He wasn't able to go in. That's a big deal. So it wasn't just because he didn't listen, because he didn't listen before, and he said certain things that he made mistakes. Moshe is not a man who never made mistakes. There is nobody on the earth, in the Torah or on the earth who has not mistaken. Everyone makes mistakes. But the question is, what does this mistake represent? And one way to look at it, it represents the idea that Moshe is not in tune to the transformation that happened in the new generation. And I just brought that interpretation because it ties well with the theme that we're talking about in the past hour. But I agree. Devotion to the Word of God is always the solution, because we use our mind, but sometimes we're biased and sometimes we make mistakes. If you do what the Torah tells you, you do what God tells you, you're going to be in good. You're going to be led in the right path. I agree. So I cannot argue with what the doctor said. I can only add a little spice, but what you're saying is 100% correct. Thank you all.
Thank you, Rabbi.